I'm very intrigued to make this video. I hope it's interesting. Hey Spuds, how's it going? It's Jamie. Welcome back to another video. First on the channel, I don't know, but welcome either way. And today we're talking about detransitioners and transphobes and transphobic detransitioners and not transphobic detransitioners. So for a little bit of context, I am a transgender man, and a detransitioner is somebody who transitions and identifies as trans, but then later goes on to detransition and live as their assigned gender again. The rate of this is around 1%, but so often detransitioners are posed as a threat to the trans community, and the assumption is made that trans people don't like detransitioners, but that's not the case at all. I wanted today to go through a couple of articles around detransitioners and detransitioning and talk about how a lot of the detransitioner stories we hear about are those from people who have been taken in by the anti-trans movement. And I wanted to go through an article today, or a couple of articles today, that are about somebody who detransitioned, became part of that anti-trans movement, and has now left and realized that it's not the nicest way to go. But it's not a surprise that often the assumption is made that detransitioners are a threat to the trans community, because that's how the media has made them out to be. So detransitioners are people who deserve compassion and support in what they're going through. Trans people do not have any animosity towards detransitioners. The fact that detransitioners exist and make up about 1% of the people who transition does not mean that we should remove the right to healthcare for the 99% of people who are trans and where it was the right thing for them to transition. However, in recent years, more and more, the media's really like to spin detransitioners as this whole like gotcha to trans people. And we have articles like hundreds of young trans people seeking help to return to original sex. And then they've got interviews with specific people who greatly regret their transition and are giving like warnings to people and not wanting other people to access trans healthcare, and almost acting as if their experience is going to be what every person who transitions experiences, and not recognizing that they are in the very small minority. And when terms like hundreds are used, and it's giving numbers and not percentages, and that doesn't say 1%, and it says young trans people, trying to indicate that it's kids that are doing this, and there's this whole big thing about
protect kids from trans people.
So I feel like detransitioners have really been weaponized, and the experience of detransitioning has been weaponized, and there is a minority number of detransitioners who go on to be transphobic once they've detransitioned. And so I'm going to go through a couple of articles. The first one is called "Former Detransitioner Fights Anti-Transgender Movement She Once Backed." Kai Shivers is fighting back against the anti-trans movement she once took part in. Shivers was assigned the sex of female at birth. That sounds very grand. Assigned the sex of female at birth, and later chose to start gender-affirming care by taking testosterone to transition from female to male in her mid-20s. She stopped taking testosterone, though, in the years that followed, while she continued to explore and question her gender, later falling into an online anti-trans group of detransitioners, people who once did but no longer identify as transgender. I've read articles in the past about how people who have detransitioned have been looking for support. They felt very vulnerable, maybe felt like they couldn't turn to the trans community for support at that time, and have found that solace from transphobic people or fellow detransitioners who are transphobic, and kind of gone down this rabbit hole. That vulnerability of them feeling isolated and lonely in their experience has really been preyed upon by anti-trans people. Now Shiva says she has retransitioned, identifying as trans-masculine and genderqueer, which means she identifies with both genders. Shivers uses she and her pronouns, but heavily identifies with masculinity, as defined by the LGBTQIA+ Health Education Centre states. She says she considers herself to be part of the transgender community. I think this is also a very common pathway for people to take to detransition or pause transition and re-explore identity and then resume transitioning, but even people who would consider themselves detransitioned won't necessarily identify as cis. And the biggest reason why people stop or pause their transition or detransition is safety. They're often in an environment where it's not safe for them to be trans and they can't access healthcare. When Shivers initially stopped taking testosterone, she sought out advice and companionship in online forums about detransitioning. In this virtual community is where she began to adopt anti-trans beliefs that misogyny and a patriarchal society caused her to initially transition from female to male. It's like intellectual transphobia, and I'm saying that, I'm just mean the transphobia that tries to have logical sounding arguments and tries to base things in reality. They're just not anyway, but it's not the transphobes who are like, no to trans people, it's people who are actually saying things. So much of it, and particularly from like tough and gender critical type transphobes, is aimed towards trans women. It's like 99% aimed towards trans women. And there's this tiny mention of trans men and trans masculine people, and it's always like,
oh, they wanted to escape womanhood and have male privilege because they fell for the patriarchy.
And that's it. And it's like, that's all you have to say. And then all of your arguments against the existence of trans women, if you actually spoke about trans men beyond that one sentence, you would be contradicting. And even that is contradictory, because how do you explain trans women walking away from the patriarchy a male privilege when you're saying the whole reason why trans men transition is to gain that privilege. It doesn't make sense. In blog posts, YouTube videos, interviews, and workshops, she spread and promoted these beliefs.
Come to my transphobic workshop, people.
God. These posts became a popular tool for anti-trans activists looking to discredit the trans community in the name of feminism. Yep, and how better to discredit a community by latching on to that 1% who regret transitioning and being like,
Look, media, this is what it's all about.
I feel like there have been time periods where we've actually heard from and seen more from individual detransitioners than we have from trans people. There's a lot more trans people than there are detransitioners. And it's fine to have detransitioners speak about the experience of detransitioning and their experience of transitioning and why it wasn't right for them. But that shouldn't be pitted as and this is why transitioning is wrong. It should be this is this person's experience, and then we hear from trans people as well. A 50-year study in the Archives of Sexual Behaviour performed in Sweden estimated that less than 3% of people who medically transition experience transition regret. Other studies have estimated similar results, some even citing lower figures. We see very, very low regret and detransition rates, and this is compared to a 14.4 regret rate for surgeries generally, and that's seen as relatively low within the medical community. So the idea that 1 to 3% is suddenly awful is ridiculous, and it's like trans people and transitioning is held to this completely unattainable standard that other medical procedures are not held to. And if they were, oh my goodness, what would the outcry be over 14.4% if people had the same attitude towards surgery regret generally as they do to transition regret? Despite this low percentage, these individuals have become a focal point of anti-transgender legislation and activism. More than 300 proposed bills across the country have targeted LGBTQ Americans in the last year, according to the Human Rights Campaign. Healthcare for trans youth in particular has become the target of such efforts. Just for reference, this article was written 2 years ago, and I do feel like things have only got worse, both in the States and in other countries. Like in the UK at the minute, it's just been announced that a temporary ban on puberty blockers for trans kids has now been made indefinite and will next be reviewed in 2027. They're still prescribing puberty blockers to kids with precocious puberty because puberty blockers are safe and reversible to take. It's just based in transphobia, not actual reality. Before the ages of 16 to 18, youth are treated with reversible treatments based on guidance from the US Department of Health and Human Services. Irreversible medical interventions such as surgeries are typically only done when consenting adults or older teens who have worked through the decision with their families and physicians over a long period of time. Physicians across the country have told ABC News. It's very true, and a prominent detransitioner, anti-trans detransitioner in the UK, who basically went to court to try to stop kids from having puberty blockers. If you read about their journey, it took them nearly 2 years to get on puberty blockers after their first appointment, and then a year or so after that they started testosterone, and then 3 years after that had top surgery, and then after that regretted. And it's like, we're not talking about a child here, we're not talking about somebody who walked into a clinic and walked away with irreversible medical treatment. We're talking about somebody who over the course of 2 years was then put on reversible treatment and then had more time on that to consider their identity and what they wanted, then chose to continue on to HRT, testosterone, and 3 years after being on testosterone had top surgery. It's not a process where like a 15-year-old kid was pushed through a clinic and came out 3 months later with a beard and having had top surgery. This was over the course of 6 years for somebody's life, but they go in pretending like they were pumped through a system instantly and didn't have any safeguarding. Despite these common practices, officials in many states have launched efforts to crack down on gender-affirming care for minors. Major medical associations support gender-affirming care for youth and adults. Transgender youth tend to have high rates of but those who transition often experience significantly reduced psychological distress. Absolutely. Preventing trans people from accessing appropriate healthcare is literally shutting your eyes to the evidence or seeing the evidence and going, oh, we don't care. It's like seeing evidence that a hip replacement would mean that somebody could walk again. And you're like,
oh, no, I don't care because 1% of people regret their hip replacements so nobody can get one. No.
We don't do that with any other medical process. A recent large study from Harvard found that gender-affirming surgery was associated with improved mental health outcomes in those who are transgender. Another recent large study from Harvard found that even among those who do go on to detransition, it is often due to external pressures such as stigma and non-acceptance in their environments rather than a sudden resolution of gender dysphoria. But that's where detransitioners come in. Detransitioned activists have often testified in public hearings on policies concerning the transgender community. And I feel like the experiences of detransitioners are not an experience that should be shunned or not listened to. But so often when I hear about these policies being made and things things happening in court, we're hearing from people who have detransitioned and have stood up and said,
it was not right for me to transition, I'm not transgender.
and they are now speaking out for the whole trans community, saying we should limit the access for everybody, rather than if they themselves have had an individual negative experience with a particular practitioner and there is medical negligence going on for that person in particular, that is what they should be pursuing. They should be talking about their experience as a detransitioner, not their experience of someone who used to identify as trans and now doesn't, but is now still speaking on behalf of the transgender community and speaking about policies and speaking on matters that impact rights for the trans community, a community that they are not part of because they are not trans. And I'm talking about specifically detransitioners who detransition, state very clearly they are not transgender, and then are anti-trans. That is the specific group I'm talking about. I was 30 and at the end of my rope when I transitioned. If I made this mistake as an adult, a young girl could too, said one detransition speaker at the October 28th Florida Medical Board hearing concerning a ban on gender-affirming healthcare for youth. Not only did my surgery exacerbate my mental health issues, I now struggle with physical complications as well. Why is a 30-year-old detransitioner who is not trans speaking in an official capacity about the access of healthcare for trans youth? They were neither a youth when they transitioned, are a youth now, they are not transgender. They have said, I made this mistake. If you make a mistake, honestly, all the support to you. Trans people are the first people to know what it is like to live in a body that doesn't feel right for you, to have sex characteristics of a gender that is not yours. You deserve support and help through this process. However, does not give you a right to go and start speaking about and on behalf of the trans community, speaking about things that are going to literally impact negatively trans people's lives. You are not a trans person. Why are you there? You've literally admitted that you made a mistake. Yes, there is a very small regret rate. Some people make a mistake because being trans is not something that is identified through a blood test or a scan. It is identified through you explaining honestly your feelings and working through those with medical experts. Another speaker at the hearing who said she started gender affirming treatment at the age of 16 and regrets it spoke about struggling with her mental health while transitioning. She urged the board to ban hormones for people under 18 and surgeries for people under 21. Under 21. In 2019, I had a life-changing encounter with Jesus and began to find deep healing within myself. After nearly 4 years of being on testosterone, I decided to detransition and accept my womanhood, she said. As somebody who is not religious, I really struggle with the whole I encountered Jesus and now I'm not trans. It feels a little like I was taken in by a group of religious people who've convinced me that I shouldn't be trans, or I was put through conversion therapy or something. It's just not giving me comfortable vibes. The Florida Medical Board later passed a ban on gender-affirming care for youth. The decision would prohibit providers from administering gender-affirming care, including puberty blockers, hormones, cross-hormone therapy, and gender-affirming surgery for people under the age of 18. It's so frustrating that we can see the evidence literally in front of us of the low regret rate, the fact that transitioning improves well-being, the fact that gender-affirming healthcare is approved by every major medical board. It is the pathway to take. The other pathway is conversion therapy. And yet stuff like this still happens, and in part because people who are not trans and made a mistake in their own lives are saying,
Oh, no, I don't think anybody should do this, because obviously if I made a mistake, everybody's going to make a mistake.
I just feel like there's a deep lack of compassion for trans people. When Shivas was in similar circles, she said she tried to ignore her uncertainty about her gender and how it conflicted with the message she was promoting. I never liked people who call transitioning mutilation or call trans bodies mutilated. A lot of them call trans people delusional, Shivas said. It is so common, and I think it's all tactics to make trans healthcare sound as brutal and horrible as possible, to make trans people sound as like lacking in knowledge over themselves, as, you know, kind of like disconnected from reality as possible, and also just to generally dehumanize trans people by boiling them down to their bodies, calling their bodies mutilated and calling them delusional. It is really disgusting language that it baffles me that it's acceptable. Living as a trans person was something that people did to survive, and actually I didn't think of it as crazy or irrational because I had lived that life. She continued, I get why some would do this, like it did help me. I did get satisfaction from transitioning, and I had to rationalize that experience and make it fit with his anti-trans ideology. It's really interesting to hear from somebody who fell into an anti-trans rabbit hole and is now like out of it and speaking about that experience, because I feel like when we hear arguments or when we see anti-trans people actually engage with discussions with trans people, it's so hard to watch because you can just see how much they're not listening. They must actively be trying to not listen. They are having their own conversation on their own planet and just not paying any attention to the points that are coming their way. A lot of what I see is trans people or people interviewing but from like a trans ally perspective pushing back against some points and saying some things and being like, okay, well this thing you just said, this piece of research disproves that. Like, what would you say to that? And they just repeat themselves. It's like people who are like, I don't like cupcakes. And it's like, why? And they just keep saying, I don't like cupcakes. And you're like, yeah, but why? What specifically about them? I don't like cupcakes, right? The conversation never goes anywhere. They just keep repeating their point over and over and over again until you get exhausted. Shiva said cracks began to show in her beliefs as more of the detransitioners and other activists she worked with began to partner with far-right groups like the Proud Boys on an anti-trans platform. This is honestly the most ridiculous thing about a lot of this, particularly when we look at turfy transphobes who say they're doing this in the name of feminism, and they're like,
we're here to protect women's rights against the transes.
And it's like, there's no conflict between trans people and women's rights. It's absolutely made up in your head. But then anti-trans groups who are like, we're feminist, we're trying to protect women, have literally partnered with anti-abortion groups to try and further their transphobia. When you look at that, it's like, how can there be any credibility in anything they do when they're like, yes, we're feminists, we're going to work with anti-abortionists? That's really not very feminist. That was kind of a huge wake-up call, said Shivas. It didn't make sense to ally with the people who were creating the oppressive conditions. I find it interesting how that was the tipping point for her, seeing anti-trans groups pair up with far-right groups. I think it's a very hard environment to get out of. I think there must be a lot of manipulation going on. Anti-trans groups have been described as cults, and we're going to have a quick look through another article that kind of goes into more detail on that subject. I think I can kind of understand why that tipping point was the far-right pairing up, because if you're trying to find community and you're struggling and you're hearing all the things that you need to hear from this group, and then kind of like anti-trans rhetoric is smattered in there a bit, and you're like, okay, and then suddenly all of their arguments and excuses for being transphobic fall apart when they partner with these far-right groups, I can see why that would be a tipping point. Her use of the hormone testosterone helped her embrace her genderqueer identity, she now says. When Shiva sees or hears anti-trans detransitioners speak about their experiences, she thinks of her past self. She says she feels guilty, like she set the stage for them. Shiva says she wants people to turn their attention to the dangers of anti-trans outreach to youth, as well as ongoing legislative attacks on trans Americans. It's very tricky because once that behavior's been done, once you've said those things, once you've caused that hurt, it's very hard to undo it. There are many people who are past the point of redemption, but I think if this were me and I'd accidentally fallen into the wrong rabbit hole, got lost, was vulnerable, been manipulated, I would absolutely go even harder in the other side to try and make up for any hurt I did. I'm not saying that's what this person has to do. I think that's how I would try and offset some of the guilt I would feel. I don't know if she was somebody who stood up in official capacities and campaigned against like access to hormones and things or access to healthcare, but I think if they were, a good way to make up for that negative impact would be to do the positive stuff on the other side. So the other article that we're just gonna have a quick look through is former TERFs and SWERFs are fleeing the cult movements known for being terrible and wrong. I don't know what a SWERF is. Sex worker exclusionary radical feminist. Wow. Okay. Dice, who wrote a viral Medium post in 2018 explaining why TERF is a slur used to sexually harass, threaten, and silence lesbians, and was formerly a regular contributor to a website that rhymes with craft a felon, revealed that he's left the gender critical movement he once embraced, looking back on his time in the gender critical feminist movement. Oh, Dice is unequivocal. It's a cult. The core beliefs of gender critical lesbians include that lesbian means an assigned female at birth woman who is attracted exclusively to AFAB people with vagina. That's just exhausting. The trans women with penises are not only interested in having sex with cis lesbians, but are calling them transphobic for not being attracted to them. The trans people are hijacking the gay rights movement. The trans managers butch lesbians with internalized misogyny. The trans people run the media. Would there really be certain articles if trans people ran the media? I think you just need to look at the... I mean, all of this is wrong, but thinking that trans people run the media is another level of deluded. And that gender non-conforming children are forced into physical transition by the trans cult. I do think there's a lot of projection from transphobic groups when it comes to how they speak about trans people, calling trans people delusional, calling trans people a cult, calling trans people dangerous, saying that trans people run the media. Those are all things that actually fit anti-trans movements and anti-trans groups, not trans people. Dice details how he got wrapped up in the international network of powerful lesbians while in a mentally vulnerable state, having just lost his job and made to live in his car. They wanted you to be unstable, that's something I noticed. The more stabilized I got, the less they could could control me, and they tried to control you. This just sounds so dodgy. In a piece on Medium that came out shortly after the publication of Dice's interview, another former member of an overlapping activist group, writing as Kelly Lawrence, posted about her experience in the SWERF movement as a former sex worker. After reading Dice's piece, she writes, "It hit home to me how similar my own experience was and how insidious the tactics of these people really are. These groups are often one and the same or overlapping. Generally, trans exclusionary radical feminists are also vehemently opposed to sex work as well as BDSM and kink." You can see it in the language when you see some TERFs speaking that they are very anti-sex work. They're very anti being like sex positive as well, just generally. They boil a lot of why trans women in particular transition down to fetishes and kinks, and they shame them for that. Like Dice, she felt like her trauma was exploited and her stories were manipulated to fit into a preconceived agenda and eventually to psychologically control and gaslight her. Oh my god. In addition to taking up excessive space in LGBTQ and feminist communities with their demands, both Lawrence and Dice expressed reservations about these groups aligning themselves with some aspects of far-right groups and agendas. We know that they position themselves with the far-right, and even if it's not deliberate or it's claimed to not be deliberate, you've really got to ask yourself a question of whose side are you on if far-right people show up at your rally and support you. Like literal Nazis have shown up at anti-trans rallies in support of the anti-trans people. I feel like that must make you sit back and go, what side of history am I on, and do I want to be on this side? It's been terrifying to watch this movement gain followers in recent years. Mainstream media, often ignorant or dismissive of LGBTQ issues, has given them platforms as a subgroup of our community rather than as the extremists they truly are. Brands and celebrities have continued associating themselves with publications who deliver their hateful rhetoric. Although I can't speak for what these former TERF/SWERF writers owe the communities they once personally vilified, it's promising to see these accounts published. Having witnessed the unhinged, illogical and anti-intellectual vitriol of this group for so long, I can only hope that this is just the beginning of a mass reckoning and exodus. It is shocking how much airtime and space transphobes are given. I think we'll look back on this in time and be like, how did so many abhorrent books get published, interviews happen, articles get written, airtime be given to these people who are literally sat there and for no other reason than being bigots are trying to tear down a marginalized community. There's literally no excuse to be transphobic. Every single reason a TERF gives, every single reason a transphobe generally gives, because TERFs are just transphobes, but they specifically like to hide their transphobia behind feminism, which is why we use a different term. Every reason given, it's like, okay, well, here's this piece of research that disproves your point, and here's this one that disproves your other point, and here are all these experiences that disprove your other 3 points. And it's like, for everything they say, there's like, well, that doesn't make sense, and here's this piece of evidence against what you're saying. And when trans people give their points back, there's never a, oh, well, I have these receipts and these bits of research and this evidence against what you trans person are saying. It's all just shouting. It's all just like, no, you're wrong because you're wrong. You're wrong because I say so. You're wrong because define a woman. It's like, well, you define a woman where you don't then exclude a bunch of cis women. Look at your definition of lesbian. That's gone round the houses to try and deliberately exclude trans women and include cis women, but it's just super messy. Just as a couple extra bits to finish on, there's one extra little article that kind of goes a little bit more into the feeling of being in the anti-trans movement. So Shivas describes this sense of community and support as intoxicating and adds, it felt like we were doing this important work and helping people. A lot of us had gone through this sort of intense conversion experience, converting to this particular interpretation of radical feminism, lesbian feminism. I feel like most of us were in some kind of real distress, and believing in this stuff felt good. We did find connection with each other. We were just connecting over transphobic beliefs and also, I would say, self-harm. It was very cult-like. It was very controlling. Shivas is clear that there is nothing wrong with detransition and that everyone's journey of gender discovery is different. The problem is that when those people search for support, they are more often than not finding radicalized anti-trans communities to lean on. I don't understand why it is not seen more clearly that these extreme transphobes that are trying to prevent healthcare, that are doing these interviews, that are writing these books, they are part of a movement that is way more in line with far-right politics and misogyny than it is with anything positive. They are just causing so much harm, and we will look back at this time. I don't know how long it will take, 10, 20 years, and be like, what the actual were we thinking letting these people have a platform? Because this is just bigotry, plain and simple. They are not feminists. They are not doing anything good. They are just completely radicalized into hating trans people. And you can just see it in how obsessive some of these transphobes are. So many tweets every day. Their whole lives have become about being anti-trans, going to rallies, organizing conferences, going to meetings. Like, all of their friendship circle and all of their support network are now within these anti-trans groups, which makes it super, super difficult to leave. But they're just causing so much hurt to the trans community. And honestly, I don't know who the hell sent the memo saying that the trans community was some big, scary thing that needed this kind of level of pushback. It's utterly ridiculous. Please just let trans people live their lives. It's promising to hear that there's been some articles and stuff written about people recognizing the cult-like and dangerous behaviors of these anti-trans groups and movements and the ideology around being transphobic, but we've not turned the tide yet. These articles are 2 years old and we've not seen this huge big mass exodus that we need to see. So hopefully that's something that will come up in the future. But yeah, I just wanted to read a couple of these articles and really distinguish that point between people who detransition and then people who are transphobic who have also detransitioned and were most likely brought into being transphobic because of the vulnerability around detransitioning. There is nothing threatening to the trans community about detransitioners. It's just transphobes. And then some transphobes are detransitioners, which is the people that trans people have a problem with. That's it for today's video. Thank you for joining. Go leave your comments down below if you want to add anything to the discussion. I really appreciate you being here. Think about giving a thumbs up and subscribing if you want to, but no pressure. And yeah, as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Much love. Bye.